If you ever think about camping deep inside the forests of America, especially the ones tourists rarely talk about, remember this story. Because some places are silent not because they are peaceful, but because they are watching. Mark, Daniel, and Chris were 3 college friends from Seattle who wanted to escape their repetitive city lives for one weekend. And when Mark suggested camping in a remote Oregon forest he had found on an old travel forum, it sounded perfect, almost too perfect, because the post ended with a strange line that none of them took seriously at the time. Beautiful place, but don't stay after midnight. They laughed it off, packed their gear, and drove for nearly 6 hours until cell service slowly disappeared and the road turned into a narrow dirt trail surrounded by towering trees so dense that sunlight barely touched the ground. And the first unsettling thing they noticed was a silence. Not the calming silence of nature, but a heavy, unnatural quiet where no birds chirped, no insects buzzed, and even the wind seemed afraid to move. Chris joked that it felt like the forest was holding its breath, while Daniel shrugged it off his nerves. Yet Mark couldn't shake the feeling that the deeper they went, the more the trees seemed to lean inward, as if closing behind them. They finally reached a small clearing just before sunset, an open patch of land that looked strangely untouched, as if no one had camped there in years. And as they unloaded their gear, Mark realized something disturbing. The ground was cold, unnaturally cold, despite it being late summer, as darkness crept in faster than expected. They set up their tents and lit a campfire, but even the fire seemed weak, its flames flickering low as if struggling to stay alive. And that was when they heard it. The sound of slow footsteps crunching leaves just beyond the tree line, deliberate and heavy, circling them at a distance. Daniel froze mid-sentence. Chris whispered that maybe it was a deer, but the footsteps stopped the moment Mark shined his flashlight toward the sound, revealing nothing but endless trees staring back at them, trying to ignore the growing unease. They ate dinner in near silence, yet the feeling of being watched never left, pressing against their backs like invisible eyes, and every few minutes someone would turn around, convinced something had moved. As night fully settled, the forest grew even darker than normal, the moon hidden completely, and Mark noticed that their watches, which had been synced earlier, were now showing slightly different times, something that made no sense but no one wanted to discuss. Around 11 p.m., Chris pointed out something that made all of them uneasy. Their campfire wasn't making any sound, no crackling, no popping, just silent flames dancing in the dark. And before anyone could react, the footsteps returned, this time closer, slow and careful, stopping just a few feet beyond the tents. Mark forced a laugh and called out, asking if someone else was camping nearby. But the forest answered with silence, so thick it felt suffocating. When Mark finally gathered the courage to unzip his tent and step out with a flashlight, the air outside felt heavier, colder, and wrong. And although there was no one there, the beam revealed something that made his stomach drop. Fresh footprints in the dirt, large, barefoot, and impossibly deep, leading in a perfect circle around their camp before disappearing straight into the woods. Chris whispered that whoever made those prints wasn't wearing shoes, and Daniel noticed something worse. The footprints had no heel marks, as if whatever walked there didn't move like a human at all. Mark tried to convince them it was just a prank or some local messing with campers, but deep down, he knew that explanation didn't fit, especially when the footprints slowly began to sink into the soil, fading away as if the ground itself was swallowing them. They retreated into their tents, locking the zippers, telling themselves that morning would come soon, yet sleep refused to arrive, and the silence outside felt louder than any scream, broken only by the occasional snap of a branch that sounded far too close. Mark lay awake staring at the tent ceiling, his heart pounding, when he realized something that sent a chill through his entire body. The footsteps hadn't left, they hadn't moved away at all, because every time he held his breath and listened closely, he could still hear slow, steady breathing just outside, calm, patient, waiting, as if whatever was out there knew the night had only just begun. The moment the breathing outside stopped, the silence that followed felt even more terrifying, as if the forest itself was listening to see what they would do next, and inside the tents Mark, Daniel, and Chris lay frozen, barely daring to breathe, counting seconds that stretched unnaturally long, until Mark checked his watch and felt his chest tighten, because the time read 12:13 a.m., the exact moment when the temperature suddenly dropped so sharply that their breath became visible inside the tents, and before anyone could speak, a low whisper slid to the darkness like a blade, calling Mark's name slowly, clearly, from just beyond the thin fabric of the tent. Mark's entire body locked up because the voice wasn't loud or threatening. It was calm, curious, almost familiar. And that made it worse, because it sounded like someone who knew him, someone who had spoken his name many times before. And when Daniel clamped a hand over Mark's mouth to stop him from responding, the whisper came again, closer this time, asking softly, "Why did you come here?" Chris began to shake uncontrollably, muttering that this wasn't funny anymore, that whoever was needed to leave, but the forest answered it with a sudden wave of laughter echoing from multiple directions at once, layered and distorted. Too deep to be human, yet mocking enough to understand fear. The sound moved through the trees as if it didn't belong to a single throat, circling the camp the same way the footprints had, and then abruptly stopped, replaced by the sound of something dragging slowly across the ground, carving shallow lines to the dirt just inches from their tents. Mark fumbled for his phone to call for help, but the screen flickered and went black, followed by Daniel's phone, then Chris's, as if something outside had flipped a switch and erased their connection to the world. And when Daniel tried his flashlight, it turned on for half a second before dying completely, plunging him into a darkness so thick it felt physical, pressing against their eyes. That was when the shadows began to move, stretching unnaturally across the tent walls, bending and sliding in ways that didn't match any shape outside. And Mark realized with horror that the shadows weren't caused by moonlight or firelight, because there was no light left at all, yet they crawled closer, wrapping around the tents like grasping fingers. Chris started whispering prayers under his breath, his voice cracking, when suddenly something pressed down on the top of the tent, slowly, deliberately, as if testing the strength of the poles, and the fabric sagged inches from Mark's face, revealing the vague outline of a head-shaped form, too tall, too narrow, lingering there in silence. Daniel screamed for it to go away, and in response the whisper returned, no longer calm but amused, repeating his words back to him in a warped imitation, twisting his voice until it sounded wrong, broken, and ancient. The pressure lifted, replaced by slow footsteps again, pacing back and forth between the tents, stopping occasionally as if listening for movement, and then without warning, something struck the side of Chris's tent hard enough to knock him over, followed by a dragging sound as his tent began to slide across the ground, inch by inch, despite Chris screaming and grabbing at the floor. Mark and Daniel lunged forward, tearing open the zipper and grabbing Chris's arms, pulling with everything they had as the unseen force dragged him in the opposite direction, and for a brief, horrifying second, Mark felt something grip Chris's leg, cold, impossibly strong, and not shaped like a human hand. And then it let go. The forest went silent again, instantly, unnaturally, as if nothing had happened, leaving the three of them collapsed on the ground, gasping for air, too afraid to move, too afraid to speak. They dragged Chris into Mark's tent and zipped it shut, huddling together as the hours crawled by, the darkness unbroken, the silence punctured only by the occasional snap of a twig with a faint sound of something breathing just beyond the reach of their hearing. Mark tried to convince himself that exhaustion was making him hallucinate, but that thought shattered when he noticed thin lines carved into the ground around the tent, forming a wide, uneven circle, as if something had been enclosing them while they waited, and at exactly 12:13 a.m. again. Though Mark didn't remember time passing, the whisper returned one last time, this time speaking directly beside his ear from inside the tent, saying softly, "You weren't invited." And in that moment, Mark understood something deeply wrong and deeply final. Whatever lived in that forest didn't hunt like an animal, didn't attack like a monster, but waited patiently, learning voices, learning names, feeding on fear, and choosing when to take what it wanted. And as the first hint of pale light finally crept through the trees hours later, Mark realized with a sickening certainty that the night hadn't ended because they survived. It had ended because the forest had decided to let them see the morning, and that decision terrified him more than anything that had happened in the dark. Morning did not arrive naturally, but instead seeped into the forest like something reluctant and unwelcome, a thin gray light leaking between the trees rather than a sunrise. And when Mark finally opened his eyes, his first thought was that he was dead because the silence was absolute, heavier than anything he had ever experienced. But then reality returned all at once when he realized Daniel was sitting upright beside him, pale and shaking, staring at the empty space where Chris should have been. Chris was gone. His sleeping bag lay flattened, his backpack untouched, his shoes still neatly placed near the tent entrance. And for a long moment neither Mark nor Daniel spoke, because acknowledging out loud felt like making it permanent. Mark scrambled outside, his legs weak, calling Chris's name into the trees, even though every instinct told him not to, and the forest answered the same way it always had, with nothing. No footprints led away from the camp, no broken branches, no disturbed ground except for one detail that made Mark's stomach turn. The wide circle carved into the soil around their tents was still there, deeper now, cleaner, as if something had traced it carefully while they slept, and inside that circle the air felt colder, heavier, wrong. Daniel pointed toward the edge of the clearing, and that was when they saw it. Chris's camera, resting upright against a tree trunk, lens pointed directly at their camp as if someone had placed it there intentionally. Mark picked it up with shaking hands, noticing that it was still warm, and when he pressed play, the footage began in darkness, shaky and unfocused, accompanied by Chris's panicked breathing as he whispered that something was outside, something copying their voices, something that had been standing too close for too long. The camera jolted as Chris turned, and for a split second the lens caught a shape between the trees, tall, impossibly thin, its outline blurred like it didn't fully belong in the world. And then the whisper returned, clear as day, speaking Chris's name in Mark's voice. Chris begged it to stop, backing away, crying, and then the footage ended abruptly with a sudden pull, the camera falling to the ground as Chris screamed once, cut short as if someone had closed the door on the sound. Mark dropped the camera, nausea rising, because there were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no torn clothing, just absence, as if Chris had been carefully removed from reality itself. Panic finally took over, and Mark and Daniel packed what little they could, abandoning most of their gear, desperate to leave. But the moment they stepped beyond the carved circle, both of them felt it. The forest resisting, the path they had taken in suddenly unfamiliar, twisting in ways it hadn't before. Trees stood closer together now, their branches interlocking overhead, blocking the sky, and every direction looked the same, as if the forest was rearranging itself to keep them inside. Daniel began to sob, saying he could hear Chris calling for help, and when Mark told him it wasn't real, that it was just the forest playing tricks, Daniel turned slowly, his face hollow, and said, "Then why does it sound exactly like him?" That was when Mark heard it too, faint but unmistakable, Chris's voice drifting through the trees, begging them not to leave him, and every step forward made the voice clearer, closer, more desperate, until Mark remembered the warning from the forum post, the line they had ignored, and he grabbed Daniel hard, screaming at him not to listen, not to answer, because whatever had taken Chris didn't need to chase them, it only needed permission. The voice changed then, twisting mid-sentence, breaking into that same layered laughter from the night before, and the forest erupted with movement, branches snapping, leaves shaking, shadows bending toward them as if the trees themselves were leaning in to watch. They ran blindly, tripping, bleeding, lungs burning, until without warning the trees thinned, and the dirt road appeared in front of them, sudden and impossible, and they didn't stop running until they collapsed beside their car, gasping, shaking, alive. Authorities searched the area for weeks, but no trace of Chris was ever found, and the official report listed him as missing, presumed dead, though no cause could be determined. And when Mark later returned the camera footage to the police, they told him something that still haunts his dreams. The timestamps on the video showed that Chris had been recording for hours after the moment he disappeared from the tent, walking deeper into the forest, speaking calmly to something just out of frame, as if he were no longer afraid. Mark and Daniel never camped again, never even spoke about that night to anyone else, but Mark still wakes up sometimes at exactly 12:13 a.m., heart racing, phone vibrating beside him with no notifications, and in the silence of his apartment. He swears he can hear slow breathing just beyond his bedroom door, patient and familiar, and sometimes very softly. It calls his name in Chris's voice, waiting for him to answer.